Hi, for today's lecture we're going to look at the tendons of the horse's foreleg. The horse's foreleg is operated by remote control by muscles in the forearm. There are no muscles below the knee or in the hock on the hind leg. So here we have the proximal end of the large metacarpal, the cannon bone. So the knee will be here, or carpal joint will be here. In the forearm we have the muscles. Every muscle in the horse's body is attached to bone through a tendon. Generally the tendons are quite short, but in the leg those are lengthened considerably, so everything can be done by remote control. The muscles stay closer to the center of mass of the horse's body to reduce weight on the extremities so the horse can gallop further and faster. So we have these long cables, the tendons that come down at the front of the leg to extend the leg. They're called extensors, or come down the back of the leg. They're to flex the leg, and they're called flexors, or to fold the leg, called flexors. So we have two on the dorsal face, or the front, and we have two on the palmar face. Because it's a foreleg, it would be plantar on the hind leg, on the back. The extensors are smaller than the flexors because they really only have to carry the bones forward. So the bones of the leg are not that heavy. And the flexors have to be much bigger because they have to carry the horse's body weight, and sometimes twice the horse's body weight. If the horse is galloping or jumping, the amount of force that's going to be exerted on the flexors is going to be substantially more than the horse's own body weight, maybe as much as twice the body weight. So the flexors will be much larger than the extensors. So let's start off with the extensors. So the principal one is called the main or common extensor. It originates in a muscle of the same name in the forearm, runs down the leg on the lateral dorsal face, so slightly to the outside and somewhat to the front, passes over the carpal joint or knee joint, comes to the dorsal face by the time it gets to the fetlock or metacarpophalangeal joint, and then makes its first insertion point on the dorsal proximal end of P1. So we draw it in something like this, where it runs down the front of the dorsal face of the leg, makes the first attachment point here on the proximal dorsal face of P1, and then continues on down the leg and makes another attachment or insertion onto the proximal end of P2 dorsal face, and then finally inserts onto the extensor process or pyramidal process of P3. So three attachment points: the proximal end of P1, the proximal end of P2, and the proximal end or extensor process, pyramidal process of P3. That's the main or common extensor tendon. Then the associated tendon that goes along with it is called the lateral extensor tendon. It's called the lateral because it lies to the lateral side of the main or common extensor on the lateral side of the horse's leg. So if you had a skeleton only of the lower part of the horse's limb, you could identify, if you had the soft tissue on it, you could identify which end of the horse and which side of the horse it was from just by the extensor tendons. So the lateral extensor runs down more to the lateral side, passes over the metacarpophalangeal joint, and makes a single insertion onto the proximal lateral face of P1. So that's the lateral extensor tendon. This is the main or common extensor tendon. So those two tendons, their principal job is to extend the leg or carry the leg forwards, the extensor tendons. So now if we go to the tendons of the horse's, the palmar face of the foreleg, we have two flexors. We have a deep digital flexor tendon, and we have a superficial flexor tendon. So we'll start with the deep flexor tendon. Again, originates in a muscle in the horse's forearm, passes down on the palmar face of the leg, right on the back of the leg, over the carpal joint, lies in the groove formed by the small metacarpals MC2 and MC4. It's quite a strong, roundish structure, passes straight down the leg and makes a single insertion onto the palmar or solar or volar face of P3. It fans out as it makes that attachment, and it attaches onto a very specific portion of P3 on the bottom face, the solar face of P3, called the semi-lunar arch. So it's this crescent-shaped, irregular, roughened surface that you'll see on the bottom face of every coffin bone or third phalange. So this is the deep digital flexor tendon. Quite a large structure that has to be able to support up to twice the horse's body weight. In extreme situations, perhaps even more. Makes a single insertion onto the semilunar crest of P3, the deep digital flexor tendon. So looking at it from here, you wouldn't see it in this region because it lies in that groove formed by MC2 and MC4. It disappears behind the proximal sesamoids, goes around the corner and makes a straight line down to then go around the corner formed by the distal sesamoid, passes between the wings of P3 and inserts, I'll draw it in as a dotted line here because it's hidden behind this wing, inserts onto the semilunar crest, which in a well-conformed horse will be directly below the extensor process. These two attachment points will line up, and that actually gives us Duckett's dot on the bottom surface of the horse's hoof. An imaginary spot, but that spot will line up with these two insertion points. So we talk about the origin of a tendon and the insertion or attachment. So origin is the proximal end and the insertion or attachment is the distal end. Again, this tendon, the deep digital flexor tendon, originates in a muscle in the horse's forearm, passes down the leg without any attachment points until it inserts or attaches onto the semilunar crest of P3, the deep digital flexor tendon. So quite a large structure. Draw it in with more substance. Again, carrying all of the horse's body weight and then some when the horse is doing anything really athletic. So that's the deep digital flexor tendon. Called the deep because there's another flexor tendon that lies closer to the skin, and that's the superficial flexor tendon. So it lies directly on top of the deep, originates in a muscle of in the horse's forearm, passes over the palmar face of the carpal joint, passes down the palmar face of the leg, lies right on top of the deep flexor tendon. Proximal, or just before the fetlock joint or metacarpal phalangeal joint, it forms a collar or a tube that encapsulates the deep. And that collar extends distal to the fetlock joint. This tube completely encloses the deep flexor tendon but does not attach to it. The deep flexor tendon slides easily back and forth inside that tube. The superficial flexor then continues on as a single structure without the tube, divides to send off a branch to the distal end of P1 on the medial face and on the lateral face, and then a second branch heads off to the proximal end of P2, medial face and lateral face. So there are actually 4 attachment points of this tendon. So single origin, passes down the back of the leg, forms a collar in the region of the fetlock joint or metacarpal phalangeal joint that totally encapsulates or encloses the deep flexor tendon but does not attach to it. It then continues on and sends out 4 branches. 2 branches go to the distal end of P1 and 2 branches go to the distal end of P2. One on the medial, one on the lateral for each of those bones. So drawing it in here, it lies right on top of the deep flexor tendon, widens out a little bit to form that collar. The collar extends over the fetlock joint, and then the structure continues on sends out a branch to the proximal end, the distal end of P1 medial and lateral side, and then the proximal end of P2 medial and lateral side. So again, 4 branches for this structure, but this is a smaller tendon than the deep. As you can see, the superficial is responsible for controlling the movement, the flexion of P1 and P2, and the deep is responsible for the flexion of P3. So whenever we're shoeing a horse, trimming a horse's hooves, what we do to the angle of P3 will directly affect the deep flexor tendon, and then secondarily it will affect the superficial flexor tendon. So again, to summarize, we have 4 tendons that we need to look at here. We have 2 extensors, which extend the leg, and we have 2 flexors, which fold the leg. The extensors are smaller than the flexors because they really only have to extend the bones, so the bones don't weigh that much, whereas the flexors have to carry all of the horse's body weight and sometimes twice the horse's body weight. When we're trimming and shoeing, we need to consider the angulation of this bone and how it will affect the load on this structure, the deep flexor tendon, or on this structure, the superficial flexor tendon. And that's it for today.